This is lecture 4.4, Ethnography and Politics. I just start out with a quick review of concepts and methods, personas and experience map. I mentioned that ethnographers ask the questions, what are the relevant personas? What are the key relationships and interactions between them? What are the key themes? And how does each persona perceive these? We can use the empathy map to kind of map some of this out, to collect data, to make as we make observations about this. We have the different types of modes of ethnographic research, and we have different ethnographic methods such as observation, participation, open-ended interviews, focus groups, discourse analysis. So this is just a quick review of some concepts and methods to put them in their minds. And then I introduce a scenario of an election. So for this lecture, after I review, I'm going to introduce a scenario. Then we'll talk about the article, and then I give them another scenario, which they will discuss in groups. So that's the outline of the lecture. So for the first scenario, I give them this ethnography of an election. I give them the personas, voters, candidates, and partisan supporters. And then we can also ask are there other relevant personas? And then we talk about possible interactions. So what do interactions look like between voters and candidates? These between voters and partisan supporters, between candidates and partisan supporters. And we can discuss what kind of interactions these groups have, or if they don't have interactions, that's also a possibility. For example, voters and candidates, the interactions might be one-sided. Well, voters might see candidates on television. Candidates might know about voters through aggregated poll data. So for voters, the candidates are kind of media icons, and for candidates, the voters might be statistics. But also, if they attend some events, maybe they see some voters, they shake some hands. So there can be different, in-person interactions or interactions mediated by polls or by media. Candidates and partisan supporters may interact at elite events such as like dinners or special meetings, closed door meetings. Voters and partisan supporters may or may not interact. Maybe voters support PACs, super PACs or PACs. Maybe voters donate to partisan political action committees, or maybe they don't have any interaction at all. And then candidates are kind of between these two different groups, and they may have more intimate relationships or interactions with partisan supporters than with voters. So that's one thing that we can talk about is, from the candidate's perspective, which personas are they more familiar with or more kind of attuned to? For the candidates, voters might be a little distant, whereas partisan supporters are very, persistent, and they know them on a first name basis. So we can also ask where we might conduct fieldwork to observe these interactions. So where could you go to see voters and candidates interacting, or to see, voters, or to see candidates and partisan supporters interacting, etc. Lastly, talk about themes. I'm just proposing 3 themes: the theme of the election, the theme of campaign donations, the theme of winning political office. And then we can think about how each persona views these themes. So we might just pick one of these themes. For example, winning political office. What does winning political office mean for the voter, for the candidate who wins the political office, and for the partisan supporter who's the candidate who they support wins political office. So for the voter, winning political office might mean that their party wins or that their favorite candidate wins. They might expect some, these candidates, these elected officials to represent them in, in their political office. Candidates for candidates winning political office, it's a career move. It may represent, like they win a competition, right? They're winning a competition. It might validate them as an individual, as a politician. It might mean that they have better prospects in future elections. For partisan supporters, their candidate winning political office means maybe they anticipate some influence. So anyways, you can pick one of these things and think about how each persona might view this theme differently. And we can also ask what ethnographic methods we can use to explore this. So for example, how might we know how voters feel about their candidate winning political office? What ethnographic method would we use to explore like their feelings and their reactions to that? Would we attend some election night party where some voters are gathered together and talk to them while they're at this party watching the polling results come in? For candidates, maybe we're at some party like the with their team. Maybe we can get ourselves invited to a party where they're also watching the polling results come in, and we can talk to their staff, and we can talk to the candidate or observe the candidates, how they are reacting as the election results are coming in. Partisan supporters, same thing. Maybe there's some kind of a so we can think about like where we would go, what kind of ethnographic methods, where we could go to observe that, and if we can't observe directly, what other methods might we use? Either field observations, digital, or maybe observation participation, possibly interviews, although observation would be better. Maybe discourse analysis, again, if we can't be there directly, but maybe there's some, voters or politicians are kind of tweeting or posting on social media or something. Although, again, this is not as good as observation, but still it might reveal candidates or voters or supporters' attitudes. So we can think about methods. And leading into the article, I also asked, why might subjects be reluctant to cooperate? Why might candidates not be available to us or willing to cooperate, or partisan supporters in particular? These elite politicians may be reluctant to cooperate because they're busy, because they're difficult to access, because for partisan supporters, maybe they don't want publicity. Maybe they're skeptical of the researcher's motives. So there can be a lot of reasons why they might be reluctant to cooperate or trust the researcher, or they might be overly cooperative because they're trying to push, they're trying to advocate for their candidate or their party. So they might be the opposite of reluctant. They might be over aggressive and trying to like co-opt the researcher to support their candidate or to promote their candidate. So these are some challenges that we might face in doing this kind of research. And then this article addresses those types of challenges specifically. So Marta Balagnani, a white American woman who was researching Pakistanis, Muslim Pakistanis in England in 2005 after the subway bombing. there by Islamic militants, fundamentalist groups. The Islamic community in England was very resistant to meet and talk with her. So, but their reactions were different. The reactions were not uniform. So the first exercise I wanted, well, as we review this article, there were several Muslim identities mentioned in the article: Muslim women, Muslim Pakistanis in Bradford after the 2005 bombing, Muslim Pakistanis who felt that they were part of an underprivileged, discriminated against group, and loud and proud, self-defined proper Muslims. So each of these groups had different perspectives about being researched, and each of their perspectives posed challenges. So we can talk about those if they recall from the article or the quiz. And I wrote these here. I guess I'll highlight these. So these are some of the perspectives and challenges. The women were more likely to decline to be interviewed, more suspicious. These, in general, the Pakistanis in Bradford feared being misunderstood or misrepresented. Underprivileged Pakistanis felt they were contributing to outsiders' perceptions of Muslims more than those of Pakistanis. So they're balancing their Muslim identity with their Pakistani identity. And the loud and proud Muslims were actually eager to be interviewed, but might bias the research because they are the most accessible, and their views may not be so representative. So these are some challenges. The article also discusses strategies for building trust, research bargaining, respecting norms of reciprocity and reciprocal exposure. I focus the next few slides on these strategies. So research bargaining is when the researcher goes into a community and provides some kind of service in exchange for access to that community, such as tutoring or other things. Respecting norms of reciprocity means adopting some of the norms of that community in order to gain access and trust. And reciprocal exposure means sharing. I mean, the researcher is asking the subjects to share personal feelings and experiences and information. And so the researcher can sometimes gain trust by also sharing his or her personal experiences or feelings or perspectives, and that's called reciprocal exposure. The researcher exposing themselves before or while asking the subjects to expose themselves. So, and then I have this table we can fill out. So here's some researcher actions, and then the students can identify which strategy is this action. So helping respondents with paperwork is an example of research bargaining. Teaching English and math, also an instance of research bargaining. So they can kind of fill this out. This is on the quiz as well. Dressing and behaving appropriately is respecting a norm of reciprocity. These speaking about personal sensitive subjects are reciprocal exposure, and giving respondents time to get to know you is respecting a norm of reciprocity. So now that we've talked about these strategies for building trust, I conclude the lecture with some group work. So I present a second scenario, ethnography of a social protest. So this is a different kind of political event. You can change this if you like, some other kind of political event, and besides, instead of a social protest, maybe ethnography of corruption, or ethnography of passing a legislative a bill in the legislature, or some other kind of political action or phenomenon, and or ethnography of lobbying. So you can pick whatever scenario you like. I just picked social protest because it's provocative and interesting to the students. So in small groups, the students can get into small groups, and they can discuss and write down their thoughts on these following questions. So it's basically the same as the scenario one, but now the students are generating the personas, 2 or 3 personas, 2 or 3 relationships and interactions. Again, it's kind of going through this scenario one, but they have to come up with the personas, they have to imagine the interactions and the themes. And so what are 2 or 3 personas in this scenario? For example, the protesters, the media, maybe the police, maybe the objects of the protest, those who are being criticized by the protest. So there's several personas involved in a social protest. Um, uh, so bystanders, right? Then they can talk about the relationships or interactions, 2 or 3 relationships or interactions between these personas. For example, the interactions between the police and the protesters, between the protesters and the objects of the subjects of the protests, right? Then where might you conduct fieldwork to observe these interactions? So, you can talk about, obviously, like being there at the site of a physical protest is one way. Maybe a social movement organization office who is planning a protest. Maybe the police police office, like police headquarters, if protesters have been arrested. So there are many sites where if the protesters end up negotiating with a group like the group they're protesting against, maybe they're at the negotiations or court, like a trial, if some of the protesters are put on trial. But there are a lot of places where, and then also digital, obviously a lot of this is being covered in social media. So they might also, digital ethnography might be relevant, or photo ethnography might be relevant for social protests, especially if these protests are getting a lot of social media coverage. So there are a lot of places where they can conduct fieldwork or ethnographic research. Then what are some themes relevant to social protests? For example, violence, the theme of violence, protest strategies, crowds, like assembling in groups, demands, right, by the group on whoever the target of their protest is. So there are several, like a lot of themes that they could choose from. And then I asked them to choose one theme and then talk about how each persona might view this theme. So this is, just like we had themes here, they can pick one of these themes. And for example, violence. So how do protesters see violence? How do the police see violence? How does the media see violence? Right, violent protests. And then which methods could they use to explore each of these personas' views? So again, observation, you know, um, open-ended interviews, of course, discourse analysis. If they're looking at social media, they could do focus groups or the open-ended interviews with protesters, before or after the protest. They could interview police, they could interview media. So there are a lot of methods that they could apply to do that. And lastly, how could they apply strategies to build trust? So here, who might be reluctant to, maybe the police are reluctant to talk to researchers, or the protesters might be reluctant, or the protesters might be very eager to talk, but other, the targets of those protests might be reluctant to talk. What kinds of strategies could they use? For example, how might a researcher approach the target of a protest? Say it's a CEO of some company, right, or a government official who's being the target of a protest. How could a researcher approach them and ask for an interview, for example? Maybe this respecting norms of reciprocity, right, going through proper channels and waiting, like not being too pushy, but or also research bargaining, perhaps maybe offering, right, with the protesters, maybe with the social movement group, a researcher can offer to, to volunteer with the social movement group for like a while, in order to gain access to that group and do like observation. So they're different. I just want them to think about these three strategies and how they might apply that to studying social protests. So, and then once they've discussed and written these down, then we can come back and talk about them and see if they're, did they choose the same personas and interactions? Did they choose the same themes? And I think what might be surprising is how diverse the student, even though it's a single phenomenon, the social protest, these students might come up with very different ideas about how to study social protest using ethnographic methods. Okay, so that's lecture 4.4. For the in-class activity number 4, open-ended interviews. I have a video here about how to strategies beyond active listening, but I don't want to spend too much class time on it. So you could introduce this in a different class period before the in-class activity. You could watch it with them, maybe do it when you do lecture 4.4, or just send them the link before the in-class activity and ask them to watch it outside of class. In class, I briefly kind of cover this. The pattern for open-ended interviews is to start by building rapport, not being physically kind of too close or too far from the subjects, being humble, like asking them, expressing like desire to like humility, expressing humility by saying things like, you have unique experiences, and I'd really like to know your perspective and this, and just if they have any questions, like why we're doing this research, and we want to kind of get your point of view out and into the world. So building rapport. I've done this activity a few times. The students, the next step is to evoke stories and explore emotions. And the very last step is to ask these question statements and then wrap up. But students very quickly, this evoking stories and exploring emotions is very difficult for students. Usually they go from building rapport, they can build rapport, but then they go directly into question statements. And the point of this activity is to, so the question statements are often like close-ended, or they're open-ended, but they have not prepared the subjects for these questions yet. And so this activity really emphasizes spending time with the subjects evoking stories and exploring emotions before they ask their questions. And I give some examples. I give example of like I interview my students about this class, Introduction to Social Science, and my questions are things like, what are some things we could do differently next semester? Did you like the video essay as a project? Is there anything you want to change about it? What about the quizzes? Do you want to change the quizzes or the readings? Were the readings too much or not enough? So I have some questions about the assessments and the content of the course, but I don't start with those. I start by evoking stories. So I ask them, for example, tell me, what does Introduction to Social Science look like for you outside of class? How to, paint a picture for me, describe for me how you are studying or preparing for this class outside of class. How did you, prepare for the quizzes? What does that look like? Where did you where are you studying? Are you studying at home or at school, somewhere else, like a cafe? how long are you studying when you do that? Like, do you study alone or with friends? Like, paint a picture for me, describe it for me. And also, and I asked them, I evoke stories about the video essay. Tell me, what does that process look like? Where were you doing it? Who were you doing it with? How long did it take? How many times did you meet? Open-ended questions. And evoking stories about their experience with different aspects of the class. And as they're telling that, I'll also explore emotions. How did you feel? Like, did you feel it was worthwhile, or you know, or kind of boring, or like how did you feel about the group work? What was your experience with that? Was it enjoyable? Was it frustrating? And kind of get them to talk about that. And once they've shared, 3 or 4 images or stories of studying and preparing, and then talk about how they feel about it and whatnot, then I can ask the questions. Okay, what do what do you think would be good to keep next semester, and what do you think would be good to change? And do you think the content was appropriate? Do you think the length of the articles was, whatever? So you can I give an example. I interview the students in class to kind of model this, uh, to also get feedback about the course, but also to model this process of evoking stories and exploring emotions for a good, 5 to 10 minutes before I get into the questions. And the students, again, even though they see it modeled, even though I tell them the pattern during the in-class activity, a lot of them will build rapport and go straight to question statements and not spend the necessary time on this. So this is the real challenge of this exercise, is to kind of encourage them to evoke stories and give them examples how to do that. So this I usually model before, not the same day as the in-class activity. I will model this on a different day in preparation. And then on the day of the in-class activity, this is the schedule for the actual in-class activity. So for 15 minutes, I have the students get into groups of 2 or 3 students. And during that time, they choose a topic that they want to interview, about which they want to, their interview topic. And then they prepare questions. And the questions, I ask them to prepare at least 2 questions for each of these categories. So what kind of questions can you ask to evoke stories? What kind of questions can you ask to explore the emotions? And what are some questions, kind of more general or abstract questions that you want to ask at the end? And I ask them to prepare these questions, in the first 15 minutes about whatever topic they want to interview their peers about. And then some of them have chosen topics like toxic friendships. In the past, some of them wanted to interview each other about discrimination or social anxiety or FOMO or whatever, dating, drinking, like alcohol and kind of drinking culture. So there are a lot of, they can choose, you can give them a few examples of topics, but they can choose whatever topic they want. They usually choose something about like student life or, relevant to their lives. And then once these these groups have chosen their topic and prepared questions, then 2 groups. So 2 groups will pair up. So you have 2 to 3 students, another 2 to 3 students, and they pair up. And for 30 minutes, each group will interview the other one. So, group A will interview the members of group B for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then group B will interview group A about their top. So each group A has their topic, group B has their topic, and then group A will interview the members of group B, group B will interview the members of group A. And then after those interviews, after they've interviewed each other, then the two groups, A and B, will choose one of the groups, either A or B, but not both, to report. And so let's say group A and B interview each other, and then they decide group A had the more interesting topic, so let's help group A to report. And then both groups, A and B, are going to prepare a brief presentation together about the topic of group A. And then they will, so their brief presentation, as they're preparing it, they'll, they're going to present the topic, they'll present the stories and the feelings, and also the insights. And even though this was group A's interview, the members of group B can participate in the presentation because group B were the students who group A was interviewing. So it's their stories and feelings that are going to be shared. And so the two groups can kind of cooperate together to tell group A's story. And then, to tell their story about group A's topic. So this all takes about 30 minutes to do the two interviews, and then to choose one group to report and for them to prepare kind of briefly their presentation, not in a PowerPoint or anything, just kind of, on paper. And it should just be about a 5-minute, presentation. And then we spend the last 30 minutes where each of these pairs of groups, will spend about 5 minutes kind of presenting the results of their interview. And so, and the goal is really to move from the topic to the stories and feelings to some kind of abstracted insights. And just to give you some examples from past in-class activities, the group who interviewed conducted the interviews on the topic of toxic friendships. After interviewing the other group, and they got a few stories, and they realized, there are two different types of toxic friendships. One is the friend who is divisive, who is dividing up friends, and another kind of toxic friendship is a friend who is exploiting you, and they're like always asking you for things, but they don't give you anything back. So here you realize like, toxic friendship has, more than one form. Like one is kind of divisive and the other is exploiting. And this is kind of so during their presentation, when they give their presentation, they'll say, we're going to talk about toxic friendships. So-and-so, one student had this story about her friend, and then tell this story. And then another student had a different experience with toxic friendships and tell that story. And then kind of analyze, like, from these two examples, we can see there are actually two different types of toxic friendships. One is divisive, one is exploitative. So this is the analysis that we're looking for after they tell the stories. And then another group did the same thing. They interviewed on the topic of discrimination, and then they were interviewing the students and asked, are there times that can you describe some time when you have been discriminated before? And then these students would share different stories. And then in their analysis, they realized, there are like different kinds of discrimination. One is kind of corruption. For example, the teacher was asking the students to like give them money to give like a grade. And then another kind of discrimination were like gender stereotypes, where the teacher thought that boys were more capable than the girls. So these are like two different types of discrimination in the classroom, like from teachers towards students. And then they kind of summarized these two types of discrimination. And then lastly, another group was asking about interviewing about social anxiety, and from the stories that the other members of the other team told, they realized, there are like two different reasons, or at least two different reasons for social anxiety. One is social anxiety when you feel guilty, like you made some mistake and your friend, you feel guilty that your friends are upset or your family's upset. Another kind of social anxiety is due to shyness. You know, you have a shy personality. So these are two different kinds of social anxiety. So anyways, that's the goal, is to, from these stories and feelings, to kind of come up with some abstract or more generalized insights about the topic. So that's the goal. And usually some groups, usually the stories are very funny or interesting. Not every group is able to generalize some insights, but some get the activity and they're, you know, very quick to do this. Other groups need a little bit of prodding. So they share the stories, but they're not quite, you know, they don't quite take it to the next step to generalize the insights. So but that's the idea for this in-class activity. So again, like this is very helpful if, you know, they watch the video out of class, and if you kind of model this for them one time, like outside of class before, or, you know, before you actually do the in-class activity to save time, so that on the day of the activity, they can just jump right into this and, you know, have the full class time to do this. So please let me know if you have any questions. In terms of evaluating the students, for this activity, I give an effort grade. I don't grade them based on, you know, how insightful are their, you know, conclusions. I just give them a participation grade based on effort. So if they're participating, they're fully engaged, then I just give them full credit. So I didn't really evaluate them kind of analytically or like in terms of skill for this activity. But I don't know, if you want to do that, you can, or if you think we should do that differently next semester, let me know. So yeah, and go ahead and message me if you have any questions about how to organize it or how to run it, or if you have any suggestions, I'd be happy to hear. Okay, I will upload this to YouTube and send it out to you. Good night.